Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. People who think and write about the ethics of artificial intelligence sometimes talk about a responsibility gap. The thought is that there are instances of harm resulting from the use of AI systems where it's difficult or impossible to know who or what should be held responsible. Some have further argued that the existence of this gap shows that our current concept of moral responsibility is not fit for purpose, and that we need to change it through a process which philosophers sometimes call conceptual engineering. Enrico Galvagni and Fabio, both based at the University of Edinburgh, have an interesting contribution to make to this debate. They do think we need to engage in conceptual engineering, but they're interested in whether and how the concept of moral responsibility can be preserved rather than changed. Enrico and Fabio, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Jim.
Great. We're going to be talking about AI systems, but we're going to be talking about responsibility for the actions of AI systems. So obviously there's a lot of ethical questions you could ask about AI systems, and the one we're particularly interested in here is kind of who, if anybody, is responsible for what AI systems do. And we're also going to be looking at a particular approach to answering that question, which philosophers have tried, which is about conceptual engineering. And we won't say right now what conceptual engineering is, but we'll get to that question later in the conversation. But you're going to be talking about how conceptual engineering might help us to answer that question about responsibility, and what particular kind of conceptual engineering we might want to be doing. So first of all, I was wondering if you could just set out what the fundamental question is here. So you're interested in responsibility for the actions of AI systems. Like, why is that an interesting question?
Yeah, that's our fundamental question is, what ways do, in general, novel technologies change, complicate, or undermine key philosophical concepts, right? So this is not we're not asking something like new. If we think about, for example, sort of nuclear weapons, we might think, well, here's a technology that comes around that's new and sort of calls us to question whether our responsibility concept can do the work around the new technology, right? Something like a nuclear warhead raises new geopolitical questions of, well, do you need consent from all your citizens to develop such a system? Do you need global consent to do this kind of thing? When these systems were deployed, they were, the Manhattan Project was a massive undertaking, secretive for many years. And those individual scientists, there are questions about their individual responsibility in relation to actual, nuclear warheads. And then questions of, well, is it just the person at the end who pushes the button who is responsible, or do we need to take into account the sort of more diffuse aspect? So it's not a new question that we're asking, but what we think is different in the case of AI, or what's novel about sort of recent technologies, and what we focus on is autonomous systems. So autonomous systems are systems that bring about actions or decisions in the physical world without real-time human direction. So those kind of systems predate, I think, the commercial application of machine learning and AI. But when we couple those things together, right, when we have autonomous systems coupled with systems that can act on the basis of machine learning or artificial intelligence, we might think, well, okay, here there might be some kind of novelty, and maybe we need to rethink our responsibility practices. So the challenge, I guess, that follows from the question of, well, do these technologies raise novel kinds of questions about responsibility, is centered around cases where we have a subclass of these autonomous systems running on adaptive machine learning that might disrupt the connection between human responsible agents and outcomes that we observe in the world.
Right. Okay. So the question about responsibility essentially is when these things do things in the world, and you're kind of particularly interested. I guess one of the examples that you give and which you discuss quite a lot is military applications, right? So you have an autonomous robot weapon system which is deployed on a battlefield, and it's going to do things which it's not directly programmed to do, right? It's algorithmic programming, and machine learning is going to allow it to, in a sense, make decisions on the battlefield independently of any human operator. And the question about responsibility as well, when that happens, who's responsible for the outcomes of those things that it does, right? Yeah. Okay. Are you aware of kind of examples of where this is happening, and where there are cases where, actions have been taken and then there is a kind of live question about who's responsible for those actions?
Yeah, and I think sort of the military context is one domain that where this plays out, and where, I mean, we often think there are very different sort of operational norms in the military as well, because we have ideas like, command responsibility, which apply in the military, which might not apply in other contexts. So command responsibility just says, well, the commander who, makes the order is responsible for the troops who are deployed on the ground, no matter what those troops do. That a commander can be held responsible for war crimes committed by their troops. So the military context, I think, is also unique in that case. So we need to be careful about sort of generalizing across different domains. So other domains where this might pick up is sort of medical diagnostics, right? So in the healthcare context, and now I'm talking about deployment, not training of these systems. So in the training of these systems, we might worry about, patients' private data, companies getting involved in the data of these medical technologies. But when we're just talking about the deployment of these systems, there have been cases where these machine learning models have been shown to be better at predicting early onset of certain diseases or risk factors associated with diseases. So they're better at humans in predicting, or they can predict earlier, meaning you can intervene earlier. Right. Now, the worry here for responsibility is, well, doctors are not machine learning engineers. They're not experts at building these kinds of technologies. So they're being told, well, the system does a better job than you. You need to sort of defer to the system in some cases. But it doesn't seem like machine learning engineers are medical experts either. So now when we turn to the question, well, who is responsible for sort of making this kind of suggestion or this kind of diagnosis, it seems like it's unclear, right? It seems like we don't want to say, well, the system itself is responsible. We don't want to say, well, the doctors are responsible. And we don't want to say that the machine learning engineers or those who've developed the system are responsible. So these are the kinds of cases, and I mean, this comes out in sort of like high frequency trading is another example, where this might come about, where you have systems interacting with one another, and there's no human involved, and the systems create sort of feedback loops, and it's unclear that we can trace responsibility to the humans who initiated an initial trade. So those are, and I mean, then we have the standard cases of self-driving cars, or, as we discussed, lethal autonomous weapon systems. But there are sort of inverse cases. We've been talking about cases of blame, right? Figuring out like who's responsible when something goes wrong. That's often the question people are interested in. But if we think of AlphaGo, which is the system that beat Lee Sedol at Go now a number of years ago, we might ask a similar question. Well, none of the people who developed AlphaGo understood many of its moves, right? Otherwise, they could have just sat in the chair and played Lee Sedol if they did. So when AlphaGo wins, right, who do we praise in that case? Who deserves sort of commendation? And we might say, well, the engineers who developed it, but do they deserve praise for winning at Go, or do they deserve praise for developing a sophisticated system? So those are just a few cases where I think the responsibility question sort of looms large.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask, so I can kind of see how those kinds of problems arise, right? Because you've got the system which is taking decisions independently of any human input. But sometimes the nature of the problem is that it's because nobody independently understands the system well enough for you to assign responsibility to any given person. So I was going to ask particularly about military applications, and where a military robot does something that we wouldn't want it to. I mean, you can imagine somebody saying, well, it's the people who deployed that robot that are responsible, right? It's, and if they didn't understand what that robot was going to do and, how it was going to make decisions and how it might act, well, they shouldn't have deployed it. And it's, it would be similar if I strapped a load of explosives to a dog and released it in Sheffield city centre. I might not understand what that dog was likely to do or be able to predict it, but it would be pretty clear that I was responsible for what happened. So why is the military application particularly not just a bit like that case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a really interesting distinction here between responsibility, for certain outcomes that you are sort of intentionally involved with, so versus responsibility for the actions of sort of a semi-autonomous or autonomous agent that you are then vicariously responsible for. So in the case of you releasing the dog in Sheffield city centre, you're vicariously responsible for the actions of the dog by virtue of some kind of relationship that exists between you and the unpredictable and uncontrollable agent. So maybe that's what's going on in cases of military applications, right? We just say, well, these are quite clearly unpredictable, uncontrollable systems deployed in what we know is a morally sensitive context where we might observe certain kinds of outcomes that are, predictable and foreseeable in many cases. The question is then whether that notion of vicarious responsibility is sufficient to cover what we're interested in. So our interest in this paper is specifically about cases of sort of full-blown moral responsibility where the action is somehow importantly attached to something on sort of about the agent's character or their intention or what they were thinking or what motivated them at the time of making the decision. And so cases of vicarious responsibility are one thing, but where we see a really pressing gap is precisely in this gap of, well, when we have systems that obstruct our ability to locate those appropriate motivations, intentions, etc., in humans, that's where the obstruction might lie. That in fact, the gap is between linking what the system does to what a human has intended or wanted to do. So I think you're right that vicarious responsibility can do a lot of the work in these cases, but our worry is that that work is limited to kind of a supervisory kind of role, and that seems a bit weaker than the kind of responsibility that we're interested in.
Yes, I can see that, but I suppose maybe to try and push back on that a bit, it seems to me that in the dog case, the reason I'm responsible for the dog is, I mean, you could describe it as vicarious responsibility, but really the reason I'm responsible for what happens is because I'm clearly responsible for the act of releasing the dog, right? So that's the kind of key act here. And I did that in full knowledge, well, not knowledge of what would happen, but certainly knowledge of the risk that might result from doing that. And I was in control of my actions when I did that, right? So the fact that I'm not in control of things that happen after the act of releasing seems neither here nor there. So is that what you mean by vicarious responsibility, and why can't we just kind of give that kind of answer?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think part of what some way to answering that question is precisely when we look at something like role responsibility, right? Your role as, pet owner or owner of the dog, you are subject to certain demands on the basis of that, and there are responsibilities that flow from that. So you just know that releasing your dog in Sheffield city centre is not the responsible thing to do.
Well, that's true, but it would still be, I'd still be responsible if it wasn't my dog, right? So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What I think is happening there that's different to, again, I think the military context is unique here because I don't have a clear read on exactly whether responsibility gaps do in fact exist in the military context because of this notion of command responsibility and because of the incredibly hierarchical structures of the military, where we can actually make these kinds of demands and say, well, if you make a decision to deploy an armed force on the ground, you made that decision that decision was free and sort of, free from coercion and all of those things. And so you are then responsible for what follows. So it's kind of like a strict liability where it doesn't really matter whether you intended to or not. You are responsible. And so I think in the military case, maybe we can just say, yeah, it is a bit sort of modeled on the case of a unpredictable, uncontrollable agent that you make an active decision to release, and you are then, by making that choice, you are responsible. I think the more complicated questions arise in cases, for example, in healthcare or in cases of like chatbots, that where it's not clear that the agent who deploys the system or the deployer or the developer or the company fully understands the risks or the context in which the system will be deployed. Because users can use these systems in a number of really interesting ways that we might not be able to anticipate, which isn't the same. I mean, maybe there's a similar case in military cases where, armed combatants get tech from, superior military powers and repurpose that tech for their own uses. But I mean, I think that's different to, us all having access to ChatGPT and being able to use it for our own creative purposes. So I think that's the important difference between sort of the military context and the context that we're interested in, where there's more of this sort of social interaction and not this clear hierarchy.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose, as you kind of said at the beginning, like part of the problem here is that some of the individuals who have acted to deploy this system in whatever context it is will understand some elements of the system, right? So the software engineers will understand in a broad way how machine learning algorithms work. They might not know what this specific machine learning algorithm is actually doing because it might be a black box. It might not be transparent to them at all. The doctors and other medical professionals will understand the medical context, but nobody really has all of that knowledge. And actually, even all that knowledge combined might not be enough to really understand what's going to happen because, as I say, it could be a black box algorithm. And I suppose one answer to that is to say, well, we need to kind of establish kind of a strict liability type approach in all of these contexts, right? So we just assign responsibility to a person or a group of people. But that's not the interesting ethical question, right? That would be a kind of dodging the question: who really is morally responsible in the cases as they stand? Great. Okay, so you're interested in conceptual engineering as a potential approach to solving this problem. Now, many of our listeners won't know what conceptual engineering is. So, would you be able to give us an idea of what you mean by that idea?
Of course, yeah, I could do that. So conceptual engineering is roughly the process of critically assessing, refining, and sometimes, maybe often, redesigning our concepts to better serve our needs. So that is what conceptual engineering is doing. In recent years in philosophy, conceptual engineering has really turned into a sort of subfield of philosophy, sort of the subfield of philosophy that basically studies the way in which we use our concepts and the way in which we should use our concepts. So that is, in philosophy, what conceptual engineering is. Now, so to get out to our topic, conceptual engineering, I think, is particularly useful in discussions about AI and responsibility because our current conceptual frameworks may not be able to fully address the complexities that are introduced by a new phenomenon or new technology like that of AI systems. Right. So if you think about it, we inherit our concepts from the past. We never really choose our concepts, right? We inherited them from the past, and yet the social and technological challenges that we face today are new challenges. So it is completely possible, and it's actually, I think, quite plausible to believe that some of our concepts that we use to tackle those challenges are not apt for that. And so we need to think about our concepts and try to change them, hopefully for the better. So that's what conceptual engineering is trying to do.
Great. Okay. So I suppose the analogy there is with engineering in general, right? So kind of engineering of the physical world is where we kind of take our knowledge of the physical world and we apply it in such a way as to kind of make the world better in some way, or to make it more suited to our purposes. Right. That's what engineers do. And the thought is here, well, we can do that with the conceptual world as well as the physical world. We can take a look at our concepts, look at the kind of job they're doing in answering the difficult questions that we're faced with. And if they aren't quite up to the job, well, we can tweak them to make them better suited to the
Absolutely.
job.
Spot on.
Okay, great. I'm always interested in when philosophers talk about conceptual engineering, though, because the thought seems to be it's not just the concepts that philosophers use that need changing. We actually want these concepts to change in general use as well, right? Because then it's going to be, because we want military people, doctors, software engineers, policymakers as well to kind of be able to make better sense of these questions. But does it actually work like that? You know, can you give an example of where kind of philosophers have done some conceptual engineering and it's actually been deployed in the world and been taken up more widely?
Sure, it is a very hard thing to do, right? Philosophers usually advocate for ameliorating or for changing a specific concept, but very rarely they have the visibility and the power to turn that implemented version of the concept into a reality that potentially millions of people would be using and structuring their world with. So that there are not many cases in which a specific philosopher ameliorates a specific concept, and then we could see that concept being widely used in the world. Nonetheless, we could think of ways in which our concepts are changed and expanded more in general, not necessarily by philosophy. So an example that I could give you here is if you think of the concept of milk. So traditionally that referred to something produced by mammals. However, more recently, as yet dietary requirements and preferences have changed, the concept of milk has sort of evolved and has been expanded to include also things that are derived from cereals and nuts. And the concept of milk has undergone change. And now we hear people arguing for both sides, right? Some people say, no, we shouldn't call milk something that is made of oat or soy. And some other people say, well, we use that product in the same way in which we use normal milk. We put it in our coffee. We use it for baking instead of normal milk. So why not? Why should we not use the same concept and just expand it? So I think that is an example of how our concepts may change. And I don't claim that any philosophers have necessarily played a central role in the case of the concept of milk, but we could see how a philosopher may make a good case, and that case could gain some traction about why we should expand the concept of milk or not.
Good, that makes sense. Yeah. I guess another example might be marriage, actually. So I can remember when there was a whole debate around equal marriage, and in this country and probably in others as well, that there was this whole question about like how marriage is defined, right? And traditionalists were kind of saying, well, no, the definition of marriage is a union between a man and a woman, right? And then people might say in response to that, well, then we need to change the definition of marriage, right? Because that's not providing us with, the kind of equality that we're looking for. So we need to engineer that concept of marriage so that it's doing the kind of job that we want it to. Good. Yeah. And I think probably philosophers were involved in that in some capacity as well in that debate. Good. Okay. That's conceptual engineering. And the particular approach you're taking to this concept of responsibility as applied in these AI applications is about the function of concepts. So could you say a bit about that? Why should we take the functions of concepts to be centrally important?
Absolutely, yeah. Focusing on the functions of concepts, we think, is crucial because the functions are basically the reason why we have and use the concepts. So the concepts are this fantastic tool that we have, and we deploy and we use them to orient ourselves in reality and in our world. But we could do that, and we use concepts because they have a specific they have functions that they're able to fulfill.
Mm.
So we have concepts like responsibility because they help us navigate our moral and ethical landscape, and they help us guide our action, resolving potential disputes. So our concepts exist and we use them because they do something for us. If our concept failed to perform these roles, they would no longer serve their intended purpose, and then people would just stop using them and they would be gone.
Yeah.
So that is the reason why we think that focusing on function is really essential here.
Okay. So what do you think are the functions of the concept of moral responsibility then?
We kind of borrow these concepts because, these functions, because we can think of, the moral responsibility. What it is, what it does is still, debated. So we try to sort of come up with a list of functions that sort of characterizes all cases where we might use this concept of moral responsibility. So I'm going to go through a few now sort of briefly. So the first one is we might think that responsibility, and when I say responsibility, I just mean moral responsibility. Moral is just a bit harder to sort of get out.
Yep.
So the first one is sort of, we could see it as a ledger function of responsibility, right? So it's concerned with the kind of moral accounting. So in this way, it helps us make sense of what can be attributed to whom, and that helps us sort of make sense of an agent's conduct. Another way to think about responsibility might be to focus in on sort of the answerability function, right? Where we might say, well, this helps us figure out who we expect to give an explanation or a justification for an outcome. So a parent, might be expected to answer for their young child, something like that. The third function would be responsibility as sort of communicative educational, right? Here we might be interested in the specific expectations and commitments that build moral community and responsible agents. So this sense of responsibility is a bit different because it's the first two that I mentioned are backwards looking in that they evaluate what an agent has done. And the communicative educational function is a forward looking sense of responsibility, where here we're interested in building moral community and sort of what kinds of agents we want to become. So this might look at sort of looking at the kind of social scaffolds that we want to maintain responsible forms of agency. The fourth function would be the sort of basic desert function, or the desert function, which is that, well, responsibility tells us who deserves what, who deserves to be punished or praised, who deserves punishment or sanction, and sort of it modulates what we think people deserve. The fifth one is an incentive function, which is again a sort of forward-looking function. So it's we look at sort of the kinds of incentives that responsibility creates, and we might avoid certain actions that would result in kind of sanction or blame, and the basis for us avoiding them would precisely be this forward-looking consideration that we think they might lead to a harmful outcome. And then the last function, which maybe isn't a function of responsibility at all, it might just be a function of liability, which is the compensatory function, which just says, well, who needs to pay up, whether that's in financial terms or in time or whatever, but who needs to pay up for when something has happened. So those are like the sort of very high level 6 functions that responsibility might serve.
Yes, and I guess we can kind of see some ways in which AI undermines those functions of responsibility, right? Can you say a bit about that as well?
Yeah, important to note here is when we look at these functions, right, what regulates whether the function applies is sort of the applicability conditions of moral responsibility in the first place, right? So, and those applicability conditions have to do with sort of knowledge and control. Usually, that's sort of the standard assumption, is that the agents should kind of know what it is they're doing, have some awareness of the potential consequences, and sort of be in control of their action, right? They shouldn't be coerced or anything like that. So those applicability conditions regulate sort of how these functions play out. So the two we focus on in the paper, 2 cases where we think AI might obstruct functions of responsibility, are the answerability function and the basic desert function. So in the answerability case, the worry there is, well, we want agents to be able to answer for an action or an outcome.
Mm.
But we might have cases where there's an AI-caused harm. So the AI is the causally responsible agent in this case, right? The autonomous system is sort of causally implicated in a harm such that no human was causally responsible.
Yeah.
And a harmed victim might want an explanation or justification as to why this action occurred. So to make that more concrete, a self-driving car crashes into a pedestrian, and the family members of the pedestrian might, want to know, why did the car do what it did? What happened, in this case? And it might be the case that none of the engineers who developed the system, no one who was involved in the development of the system could explain why the system failed in the particular way that it did, or why it decided to act in the way that it did, given the fact that the system might be a sort of black box, right? So we can imagine a case here where a victim has the sort of reasonable expectation to an explanation because of a harm, and there is no forthcoming agent who can provide that explanation. And that might be a case where we have an obstruction of sort of what Maximilian Kiener has called an answerability interest. Someone has an interest in having a harm or an outcome explained to them or justified, and there's no agent forthcoming who can do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay. So I can see what the problem is there. So the conceptual engineering response to that would presumably be, well, let's just change the concept of responsibility so that we can fill that gap and it can apply better then. So is that what you're recommending?
Something like that, but Enrico is gonna tell you why that's what we're doing.
Right. So in this space, most people, the majority of scholars in this space, really sort of argue for that way of going around. So they argue that we should revisit our concept of moral responsibility. It's not always an explicit stance that they take when it comes to conceptual amelioration, but often they try to expand our understanding of moral responsibility precisely to better address problems generated by AI. Our view leans towards a different approach, which is something that we call preservation, and a preservation approach, which takes the concept of moral responsibility as it is today to be something worth preserving in the face of the pressure that technology, such as AI, influence on that concept. So we think that basically changing the concept could bring unintended consequences across legal and moral domains. And we could, in principle, engineering a new concept of moral responsibility or ameliorating the moral responsibility concept that we have, but that would generate quite a lot of problems for us. And maybe putting on a balance the problems that would create versus the initial problem that we are discussing, that of responsibility gaps, we would be better off actually having to deal with some responsibility gaps, but maintaining our core notions of moral responsibility.
Okay. Is one objection to the idea of engineering a concept like this that, well, there's a reason why we have the concept of responsibility that we do, right? So, I mean, the thought about kind of holding somebody responsible for something that they weren't in control of or that they didn't have the right kind of knowledge about. The reason why we have a concept of moral responsibility that's like that is because it's just unfair to hold people responsible for things that they're not in control of or don't have the right kind of knowledge about. So just arbitrarily changing the concept so that it encapsulates those kinds of cases, it looks like you're going to be treating people unfairly. Is that part of what's worrying you here, or am I off base with that?
Definitely, that is part of what is going on. Yes. So it seems like a revised notion of moral responsibility could help us cover and basically fill these responsibility gaps, maybe, but it would do so at the cost of having to discard some of our other moral intuitions, including what you were talking about. So the potential fact that it seems unfair to hold someone responsible for something that they weren't in control of. But what we are really worried about, in addition to that, is the fact that if we change our concept of moral responsibility to perform better in cases of AI deployment, then our concept of moral responsibility revised in that way would also have to apply in other domains of our life.
Yeah.
And we would have to end up basically using that concept in the majority of the cases in our life. And there, that supposed amelioration would go to the detriment, would not be a benefit, would actually be a problem for our moral practices.
Yes, that makes sense. So you can't just say we'll have a different concept of responsibility, which we'll only use in this kind of case, because that's really ad hoc, right? If you're supposedly improving the concept of moral responsibility, it should apply in all sorts of different domains. But then if you're doing like that, the bad consequences of doing that are likely to outweigh the good consequences of improving things in this particular domain. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, okay. So you're suggesting rather than conceptual engineering in that sense, actually changing concepts, that we should seek to preserve the concept of moral responsibility that we have. But you're still calling that a species of conceptual engineering, right? So I was wondering, in what sense is that conceptual engineering? Isn't that just ignoring the problem?
Good, yes. That is precisely one of the reasons why we started to work on this project, is because we saw cases in which people were advocating for ignoring conceptual engineering attempts to change our concept in order to basically do what we are trying to do, to preserve the concept that we have. And we thought that doesn't sound like the best possible way to go around doing that. If we think that some of our concepts are good as they are, and we see people within and without the academic space putting those concepts under pressure, it seems to us that we should rather try to argue against them rather than just ignoring them. So in that sense, we think that in a way, we align with the idea of conceptual engineering insofar as we are developing philosophical account of a specific concept, and we aim to do so in order to basically, instead of improving the way in which we use that concept or improving the concept itself, by maintaining it. So if you think about the concept, the engineering metaphor again, engineers sometimes have to check that something is still compliant to a certain standard, or that a specific bridge is still in good shape and people can still use it. So that sort of preservation of the engineer still falls within their domain. So that's something that we have taken as inspiration for the project.
Okay, that makes sense. Great. So that's where we've got to. So you're interested in using conceptual engineering to, I suppose, make sense of the concept of moral responsibility as it applies in these kind of AI cases, and you're going to do that by trying to preserve the concept. But one thing that you said is that it might be necessary to kind of live with some of these responsibility gaps. Is that right? Do you think that there are ways of filling any of those gaps while preserving the concept that we have, or is it just that we will have to kind of live with the fact that those gaps are going to exist?
Well, I think in practical terms, there is going to be something that we gain and something that we lose in either of those two options. Either we go with a preservation approach to the concept of responsibility, and that in that case, we may be left with some cases of genuine responsibility gaps where it seems that we are just unable to assign more responsibility. But those cases so far, given the state of current technology, seem to be quite rare. And we think, again, that the disruption to our moral practices that would be generated by changing our concept of moral responsibility would be much worse than those responsibility gaps are right now. Of course, we don't know what is going to happen with respect to the development of AI. So we are open to the fact that in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, responsibility gaps may be so widespread that moral responsibility gaps will be so widespread that it will become necessary to introduce or revise a concept in order to deal with those gaps. But so far, it seems to us the balance is on the other side.
Yeah, okay. So far, you kind of argued for this as a general approach, but it sounds like potentially the beginning of an ongoing project. So is this something that you're going to be continuing to work on, to roll up your sleeves and actually get involved in these conversations around the concept of moral responsibility in AI applications?
So, I mean, this project kind of started off because Enrico joined the University of Edinburgh, and he emailed me, we had coffee, and we sat next to each other and read a paper on conceptual engineering and moral responsibility, and we thought, hey, let's write something together, and it flowed very naturally from that. And what we really sort of noticed here is that this way of framing the preservation versus sort of ameliorative approaches in conceptual engineering was sort of really edifying, not just in conceptual engineering, but for looking at arguments that are made outside of that space, right? So as Enrico was outlining in the paper, we look at cases where people are talking about AI leading to things like responsibility gaps, but also ways of reconfiguring, for example, the concept of agency, thinking of agents not being capable of just making direct decisions, but agents as having sort of social power, right? So when we think about technologies can have something like social power and change, the way that society is organized. We think of social media platforms or technologies like that. So going forward, I think we're really interested in looking at the ways that this sort of framework can allow us to understand what's going on in different domains,
right?
And those domains don't need to necessarily be, looking at just the responsibility concept, but rather what does it mean to really think about what we lose when we sort of focus, because there is this natural tendency to think we want to improve the concept, we want to make it better, because then everyone wins. We have a better concept, but really, I don't think there's been a clear balance of showing, what we could also win by trying to preserve. It's less flashy, but I think it has a cross-domain application, which I think we're both sort of really interested in exploring, is how that might map out.
That's really interesting. Great. Well, maybe you'll come on again and let us know how it's gone somewhere down the line. But for now, I think that's all we've got time for. So Fabio Talon and Enrico Galvagni, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Jim.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes, and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.